Okay, indoor shooting range Q&A session. This is going to be video number 2. First one was about 30 minutes. I did unintentionally skip cost, one of the topics that Wendy mentioned in her post. Yes, the cost is very important. What I don't see, and I haven't scanned all of these, but what I don't see, finding investors, we'll cover more of this. We'll get into these. But what I don't see is what is the return? I mean, the cost is one issue, but what are the returns? What's the ability to make money and be profitable? Are there easier, safer ventures? Yeah, I would argue that there are. But if you're, but I think you could say that about any venture. I mean, if you said, well, I'm going to start a technology company and make $1 billion. Well, yeah, but you're one in, 1% of tens of thousands of ideas come to fruition in that space, literally. If you look at, just look at a Y Combinator video, statistically speaking, I mean, those groups who incubate tech startups will tell you 1.5% of whether it's 100 or 1,000 apps and technology driven ideas actually turn profitable. And even a smaller slice of those become, Airbnb and Amazon and that sort of thing. So there's real value, I think, from an investment perspective in an indoor range because you typically have both the real estate and the business. And there's a real strategy here that has come to play, which is fund your first range, get up and running, show a year or two of profitability, and then do a sale leaseback. Meaning you sell the building to a group of investors who want you as a long-term tenant, and then you take the proceeds from the sale of improvements that had costs associated with them from several years ago, years prior. Now costs have typically increased, and so you have a higher appraised value, and you have a proven business, and you pull cash out, cash out of the existing quote unquote business by creating a separate investment opportunity. A little bit in the weeds on that, but let's talk about cost here, and then we'll jump back down to where we left off. Cost of a shooting range, not a cheap venture on a per square foot basis, really more expensive than all retailers otherwise out there is a safe way to characterize it. But it's what we deal with in this initial step in the process. And I mean, before you go hire an architect and a general contractor, and before you're talking to people about property, brokers, the mayor, before there's a lot of public information about your hope, dream, vision, my strong encouragement to you is get this sorted out on paper. Go through the process of defining your vision, weeding out the good ideas from the bad, and what makes the business model really work. Do you know those? Do you know what that is? What's it going to take to get there? From a timing perspective, from a money perspective, from a physical, the site and the physical improvements, there's a lot that goes into this process. And I think a lot of people stumble into it not realizing until they're way down the road and have made a big investment in time and money to realize how much their effort goes into sorting through these issues. It's just not as simple as, everybody that I've ever worked with to help build their range, we've gotten a couple of months into it and they just said, I had no idea, Stuart, what you're doing and what this process is going to encompass, but let's keep going. This is amazing. So just be aware that it is not as simple as it seems. All right. So cost is going to include several major categories. And so the way my budget is structured is real estate, soft costs, hard costs, and then working capital. Working capital is typically going to be in a separate loan from your acquisition and construction loan, which will cover real estate, soft costs, hard costs. How you structure your budget document and how your budget and your costs are presented to the bank is critically important to surviving the underwriting process and appraisal processes. Don't get derailed by that. That's just is a tripwires galore. So cost is really important. I want to nail that down before in the process of discovery and demographic reporting and so forth, because when you're in that stage of this process, there's not a false deadline. There's not a zoning meeting here pending. There's not, the expenses of an architectural firm, their next invoice is coming and you got to pay it and you got to get closer to getting the funds raised and debt and loans secured and so forth. Plan out, take your time, breathe easy in this initial step in the process of discovery and planning and demographic reporting and budget without having this false urgency. It's not false, it's real, of all that comes with a schedule of pursuing real estate. We'll talk more about that later, but the budget process, total project cost on the dirt poor, cheap end, small retail, and just a handful of shooting positions is going to be, in the $3 to $4 million range. If you're thinking a gun range is going to be $1 million, well, even if you have an existing building, well, what does that $1 million mean? Are you buying the real estate? Are you leasing it? There's a bunch of complications around leasing that need to be accounted for and discussed before you go too far down the road. All of this is information that we'll cover in the online range conference. So cost is a huge driver, huge consumption of our time, but mapping out what those are. The budget's usually, if you see one of the pre-registration videos, I do talk about cost to some extent, but it's typically the budget, cost to establish budget spreadsheet, which is one of about 8, is going to have 40 to 60 line items in it. And I'm not talking about chairs in the classroom, tables in the classroom. All that FF&E is one budget line item. So enough on cost for now. All right. My question concern in getting the city council to allow gun range to be built. Second question is, how do I obtain the support, financial knowledge, people willing to help me with the process of building an indoor range? Okay. City council, here is the strategy and why I will not, part of why I will not publish these videos publicly on YouTube. They're unlisted. So my strategy on zoning is, number one is, do I have my business model sorted out? Do I know what my budget is how many square feet, and why are those important? Well, because if I'm going into the zoning process, that means I have found a specific property that will accommodate my vision. So I got to know what my building square footage is and roughly how it lays out, and does it fit within the confines of this property, whether it's raw land, a pad improved site, existing building I'm going to renovate or expand onto with the range portion. There's absolutely no point in going through the process of zoning hearings if you don't know that the site is going to accommodate your vision, and knowing what your costs are, because in some instances that zoning process is going to potentially result in more costs. The easiest example I can give you is from a sound abatement perspective. I read a zoning ordinance in a municipality, a big city recently, a year ago, that said sound from a gun range, indoor gun range, must be imperceptible at the property line. Meaning you cannot hear it. I've never built a gun range that was that quiet. So how do you navigate that? Well, you got to know what your budget is and what your parameters and your limitations are, and you have to know what the expectations of the city are as well. So here's the strategy for zoning. Never go find a site and then take that site to the city officials to ask them if it's what it's going to take to get approvals. I always go to the city empty-handed and say to them, even if I already have a site, even if you have a partner that owns the property outright, I don't care. do not mention it, do not talk about it, do not disclose where it is or any of that. Just go to the city and say, I'm starting the site selection process, and where do I go? What are the limitations for me? What zoning districts will accommodate a range? That's how you get that process right the first time. Why and how, separate conversation, but I would not disclose to them where you want to build a range until they have answered for you where a range goes. Second pro tip on zoning I'll mention briefly is you're more than likely not going to be rezoning property. The terminology is going to be either an SUP or a CUP, special use permit, conditional use permit. There's some other cities I've dealt with that have a slightly different name, but you're applying an approval to a specific property that has conditions attached to it. Some cities specify what those conditions are for a gun range, and some don't. They're making it up. So you want to control that process as much as possible. And that's where I haven't talked about this, but I do have a impeccable record of dealing with zoning approvals across the country in some really difficult and challenging municipalities. So a lot more strategy to come on zoning. It's a great question. I am big on controlling the information and controlling the narrative and asking more questions and doing less talking, other than trying to reassure and provide them with a degree of confidence, which as a result of the online range conference you will have as you're entering those conversations with your city officials. Okay, second question, how to obtain and support financial knowledge. I'm just going to say the online range conference is the best way to do that. Arming yourself with the right knowledge. You can spend a ton of time talking to range equipment manufacturers about which bullet trap and ceiling baffles, and the city's going to potentially want to know, all right, is it totally contained? Yes or no? Yes. Great. That's where most of them, they're like, if you have all the steel that's going in there, concrete bunker or so forth, you're good. Few of them will want, to know why your indoor range points to their property beyond, which is, and I guess if you don't know anything about a range, it's kind of a good question, but the bullet trap is, bullets don't go through bullet traps and the wall of the range. So it can point in any direction. So, all right, moving forward, cost and timeline to build a range from Alan. Good question. Cost depends. Are you building 12,000 square feet and 12 lanes, or 32,000 square feet with 26 lanes? I don't mean to be flippant about it, but the answer is it depends. You can get a quote from an equipment manufacturer, but it's just a quote for the wheels and tires. If you're building a vehicle, you need to know about the engine, the suspension, the transmission, and with as much confidence as you will get from an equipment manufacturer sales rep about what they're offering you, it is at most 10% of what I spend my time on in this process of establishing ranges. So go have those conversations, explore bullet traps and retrieval systems and pretty stall walls and so forth, but you've scratched the surface and covered about 5, maybe 10% of what you're going to need to know to get funding, zoning, get under construction, and build it. I'm telling you, I build gun ranges for a living, and I have quotes on my desk for range equipment, millions of dollars worth of range equipment, but it is a small fraction of my time. Okay. Timeline, great question. Also, timeline it depends. What does it depend on? Site selection, that can take some time. I've been in markets where we found suitable property within a day or two, put it under contract, rock and roll. Others like North San Antonio, 1604, the loop. very difficult. Tight market, some land opportunities, but not as many as you would think. And it took us months to churn through multiple conversations and come back to sellers and work through those relationships and secure property in a way that allowed us to navigate zoning approvals and so forth. So site selection is one big factor that contributes to time. Second is going to be the zoning process, which once you have your documents necessary to make a submission for zoning, which takes time and it includes design fees from either a civil engineer or an architect. Once you have those documents compiled, then the official start of the process can take at least 60 to 90 days. And in some places, if the zoning process for a conditional use approval is not friendly, it can take 6 months. So you got to be able to survive this process. You got to have a willing seller who allows you the opportunity to go through that process. There's just a bunch of moving parts, and that's in the implementation phase of the services that I offer after the online range conference. We dive deep into those strategies and how to navigate through them with success, because you want to set yourself up on the right trajectory to survive those processes. So the other big time factor is raising the money. The quickest I've been through this process, to answer the question, is on a new build was 13 months from the date we started the budget process, design, and so forth. 13 months, permitting, construction, open the doors. Typically, I tell people it's going to be 18 to 24 is safe. But if you, depending on your investor relationships and how long it takes you to raise the money, so the financing piece of it is kind of the third. Real estate, zoning, and then the financing are the variables. The design process should take a finite amount of time if well managed. Construction should take a finite amount of time, whether you're building 12,000 square feet or 30,000 square feet. Time frame is not going to really vary very much. The only construction variable on that has a bearing on time is if you're in Idaho and you have cold winters with snow, the process of laying brick or concrete in the winter, man, that can grind a project to a halt. So when you break ground is going to matter in those environments. Then otherwise, the only other factor is going to be how much site work, utilities, and grading needs to occur. And those are the influences on time. But otherwise, everything else is relatively controlled within our schedule. So, okay, next question. We're about 15 minutes in. I'll try to keep these to 30 minutes. Need assistance planning design for an indoor range. That's great. No problem. The design process starts within the budget and the documentation of discovery and demographics. Would be helpful to get a proforma. Yes, that's part of the online range conference for sure. Cost of return investment. There it is. I thought nobody had asked about it, but that's exactly what we get to. You, your partners, your spouse, your investors, all are driving towards that ever important. What's the return? Why am I doing this? We're doing it to serve the community. You're doing it to engage people and to provide a valuable service, but obviously you've got to make money. So the budget process that we go through will result in a 10-year, year by year, all the inputs, outputs, and what's the return for your investment group. Absolutely. Okay, all about how I can create a gun range and the section more important financial. Same as above. We will cover that. Partners, investors, yes, we'll arm you with not only the data and the information and the metrics that we use to kind of summarily say, oh, you have a question or a concern about how big our building square footage is and how many shooting positions and why. Oh, here's the answer on how we've proven over the years. Here's the answer and the metrics behind that, the data behind it. And few people will like question and say, well, I don't like your numbers. Well, okay, but 9 times out of 10, oh, great. You've seen it. You've done it. We're good. And once they understand what that metric is and the math behind it, there's really no arguing. So, okay, next question. Done a lot of research and consulted with range builders over the last 2 years. I know what I need to build to make it work. I just need funding. Danny, yeah, great. This is, I have a video on this, sort of this. And so sidebar, I guess, is this process can become protracted. And as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, one of the key elements for the time frame for building a range, real estate, zoning, and the funding piece of it. And so the relationships that you have are important, but they're also of value, because if your immediate circle doesn't have the means, you're in a more, you're coming from a more, let's just say, blue collar environment, and you don't have friends who are wealthy and will invest with you in the range, and you don't have the means to put a significant amount of money towards the equity requirement, then you got to develop those relationships. And who you're going to do that with? Typically, it's going to be people within your community. Going out to a VC firm is pretty rare, just because of the way VCs are structured. They're just not, they don't pan out. So it's going to be within your network. The compelling advantage to going through the online range conference is that you're backing up your vision with data and proven knowledge and metrics, and not just putting forward this, we don't have a range, this idea that we don't have a range and we need one. Well, okay, but that's not really, I can't really sink my teeth into what's the revenue, what's the operating expenses, and what's the projected return. That's where the rubber really starts to meet the road in those conversations that are going to propel you into, ideally, into a network of conversations about raising the money. What's important within that is don't go find property and start zoning and spending a bunch of money until you have developed some level of rapport. The investor conversations are in phases. First is what I would just call is an empty-handed conversation about raising money with a potential candidate investor. This is a two-way street, this conversation. This is not you asking for their money. It's you offering them an opportunity to invest. You might need them, so it feels like you're asking, but mindset shift is develop the business model, understand it backwards and forwards through the online range conference, and you will have mapped out for them what should be a very simple and clear pitch. You're informing them, providing them with the basics of the knowledge that you have acquired, and they're either yay or nay. They're either in or out. There should not be a long 30, 45 minute, 3-hour haggle session or presentation. And I have 30 slides. It's, hey, here's the total project cost. Here's my equity requirement. Here's how I want to onboard equity partners to participate in the business. And it's 15 minutes and it's a yes or no. It might take longer because there's the relationship to develop, but to get to whether or not an investor has genuine interest, generally that initial conversation is just you getting a sense of them and their mindset, and likewise for them. But it is a two-way street. I'd encourage people just strongly to not look at it as an ask. I have a book recommendation. If anybody's interested in it, let me know. And again, it'll really change your mindset, be very empowering. If you don't feel empowered in this process, something's not right. Okay. Let's see. I totally lost track of where I was. I should just keep my cursor on where these are located. Gain knowledge. Okay, we covered that one. And let's go about 5 more minutes here. All about how to create a gun range and the section, more important financial. That's what we covered just then. Sorry. If I'm not covering the investor piece thoroughly, to give you the context, let me, by all means, just chime back with a question to further clarify it. A ton of research. Yeah. So my consulting history has been really less consulting and more fee development. Still kind of a consultant, but I see a consultant as someone you hire when you think you need help or for a specific, very narrow scope. And I've avoided that over the years because I feel like gun ranges are multi-million-dollar investments. And if you've not established several of them like I have, then the opportunity for me to apply what I have learned and seen and heard and my experiences and what people have taught me along the way, I can't deploy if you just call me and say, just answer this question for me, Stuart. It's really why, like, in 3 or 4 instances, I've worked on an hourly basis. And usually it's more on the design side than it is anything else, because the budget process and discovery and demographics and vision and sorting all that out, I'm looking into the future and thinking about the implications on the budget for those issues, whether it's real estate or investors or zoning. And a comprehensive look is of far more value to the folks that I'm working with than me just answering an individual question. So if generally what happens is the questions that you have, we will answer, and then we will get into a whole host of issues that you didn't realize were questions that needed to be answered. So I don't want this to sound rude, but I generally am not. This is not a situation where the client who wants to build a gun range is driving the process. Why is that? Well, because I've shown over time and proven over time that sequencing these tasks and knowing what the tasks are and what the sequence of them, and having proven it over time, is extremely valuable to surviving the process. Okay, public indoor shooting range for rifles in Northeast Wisconsin. Okay. I think I've been to Wisconsin. Would like to visit. Depends. East Coast, I'm in North Carolina. I grew up in Texas, but live in North Carolina, and we don't have 1,000-yard deer hunting. You're in the woods, and it might be 100 yards. So the further west you go, the more prevalent that is. And so rifles, are you talking about building 100-yard? Let's talk about 100 yards for a second. 2 things. One is, should they be built? I'm going to say yes, not all the time, not in every market. I've got a 100-yard range that we built. It's a 19-lane range, 25-yard bays, and then 3 lanes are 100-yard. And they effectively drove helped contribute to, not by themselves, but this range that I was helped establish a couple of years ago, another range that opened 6 months earlier ended up going out of business. So 100-yard can be an advantage kind of in a market like that. I've got a couple of others where the 100-yard is the only one in the area, and from a membership sales perspective, it's an advantage. If you isolate it and look at it by itself, the 100-yard, if it's $1 million to build the building and the range equipment, $1.2 million maybe, then no, you're not going to say, well, I've got members who are using that 100-yard and it makes more money than I invested in it. But on the whole, it's kind of like food and beverage. Is your food and beverage business going to make more money than it costs to run it in a range? If you're really good in the restaurant business, like you come from that space and you're maybe, but if you're brand new to food and beverage, probably not. But you can run it so that it supports and boosts other streams of revenue, membership sales, catering events and so forth. And likewise, the 100-yard typically does do the same thing. It creates an air of belonging, and from a marketing perspective, offers a different and unique experience. And if you leverage it in your marketing efforts that way, it can be very advantageous. So otherwise, rifles, indoor shooting range for rifles, pretty much all ranges we've been building the past several years are rifle rated. Whether they're 15 yards, 25 yards, 100 yards, they're all going to be rifle rated. Most of the equipment manufacturers kind of will say, well, you can do a pistol rated and it's milder steel, but in the end of it, the vast majority of the time, I'm going to say just make it all rifle rated and you don't have any issue about it, because modern sporting rifles, AR platforms, you should be, for most people, shooting them in a shorter distance. The 100-yard for tactical rifle shooting is not the best environment. The 100-yard is really going to be for precision rifles. So that's why I say East Coast scope mounted bolt gun, great in the 100-yard. AR with a red dot, probably not great for the kind of tactical home defense, because those distances, that 100-yard bay, you're better off in a shorter bay, is the bottom line. For just to get net out a quick answer. There's more to discuss on that, but for sake of churning through, I'm going to skip to the next video. This is turning into be rather lengthy. I hope it's informative and look forward to your feedback.